Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. We're going to continue our Nobel Prize series or podcast, this time with an author who I believe is one of the most worthy recipients of the award. I am referring, of course, to the US author Toni Morrison. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the year 1993, and it was awarded to her, let me share with you the citation, quote, who in novels characterized by visionary force and poetic import gives life to an essential aspect of American reality. So that is the citation for her right there. Now, until a couple of weeks ago, I had only read three works by her: The Bluest Eye, Sula, and Beloved, in that order. I absolutely loved all of them, but I wanted to read something different. I wanted to read something new instead of rereading something in order to share my thoughts with you on her work. So I thought to myself, okay, I have shown you in a previous video, it was a book haul that I did like 3 years ago, a book by her that I bought at that time. This was in the summer of 2022. And that is, of course, Song of Solomon. This is a very important book in the Morrison corpus for many reasons, some of which that we are going to explore in this video. But many of those reasons deal primarily with the content of the book and also with the structure, just so you know. So those are the two most important elements that we are looking at here in this video, of course. Now, Song of Solomon was published in the year 1977, just to give you a little bit of context. And this was Morrison's third novel after The Bluest Eye and Sula. And the edition that I have, this one that I have just shown you, has a special foreword by the author in which she explains that Song of Solomon represented a bit of a departure for her. It was also a challenge, and it signaled the adoption of a different kind of style, a style different from the ones that she had used, for example, in The Bluest Eye and in Sula. So let me read you what she says about this particular topic. Morrison says, the challenge of Song of Solomon was to manage what was for me a radical shift in imagination from a female locus to a male one. In such an overtly stereotypically male narrative, I thought that straightforward chronology would be more suitable than the kind of play with sequence and time I had employed in my previous novels. So that gives you an idea of what kind of a shift, what kind of a departure we are talking about here. Song of Solomon was dedicated to Toni Morrison's father. It was also a very important source of inspiration for the novel, as she explains in that little foreword that is included in this edition that I have. So the novel's opening has also become famous. I wanted to read you just the first line right here, which was very carefully crafted. Morrison talks about this also in the foreword. The novel begins, the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance agent promised to fly from Mercy to the other side of Lake Superior at 3 o'clock. I love that detail right there. 3 o'clock, right? So that, of course, sets the tone for the novel, as tends to happen with narrative. Song of Solomon is the story of Milkman Dead. That is the name of our protagonist. And he is born right after that attempt at flight by that insurance agent. Milkman belongs to an African-American family that has very good social or economic status in this case. And that is going to mark him, of course, for the rest of his life. His father's name is Macon. And he is a man who is quite prosperous, and he believes in property. He believes in ownership. The family has a beach house, to give you an idea what kind of social, socio-economic status we are talking about here. He has two sisters. One of them is named Lena, and the other one is named Corinthians, after the book in the Bible, of course. And he has also an aunt named Pilot. Okay, pilot as in the guy who washed his hands, not as in the pilot of a plane, though there is a deliberate choice in the name and in that little confusion that may arise with the name. As you may know, and you know this if you have read anything basically by Toni Morrison, she is very careful when it comes to choosing the names of her characters, and Song of Solomon is really not an exception to that. So the aunt, right, her name is Pilot. Milkman has been told to stay away from her. He doesn't know why, but he's going to find out why as the story progresses. And actually, that is when the novel gets really interesting. This happens towards the beginning. And that is when Milkman actually comes into contact with his aunt, Pilot. He visits her house, and there he meets her daughter, Reba, and her granddaughter, Hagar, with whom Milkman is going to, very, very close to the beginning of the novel, begin an affair. So we already have a connection right there between these cousins, right? So very interesting dynamic there with the family. We have talked then about Milkman's family. We should also mention a very important friendship that he has, and that it is with his friend Guitar. Okay, so the two grew up together, but they are separated by their economic status and also by their ideas. There's a very important difference here. You know, the idea of the two friends is a very important trope in US literature. And sometimes the two friends are opposites, almost like a Don Quixote, Sancho Panza kind of thing. You can think about many novels where you have that trope of the two friends. And you can see it also in Song of Solomon. And in this case, you know, the two of them have just very different approaches to life, in part because they have had very different upbringings, right? So one of them is kind of very well off and the other one not so much, right? So I just wanted to share with you something that kind of stresses or illustrates the difference between these two friends. And for example, at one point, Guitar is trying to explain the situation, why things are the way they are for African Americans. And he says this: "Listen, baby, people do funny things, especially us. The cards are stacked against us, and just trying to stay in the game, stay alive and in the game, makes us do funny things. Things we can't help, things that make us hurt one another. We don't even know why. But look here, don't carry it inside and don't give it to nobody else. Try to understand it, but if you can't, just forget it and keep yourself strong, man." That is his perspective of things. And he's trying to explain, you know, his viewpoint to Milkman, but Milkman has a very different perspective on things. And for example, just a few pages after that, that was from page 87, this is from page 107. This represents the perspective of Milkman. He was bored. Everybody bored him. The city was boring. The racial problems that consumed Guitar were the most boring of all. He wondered what they would do if they didn't have black and white problems to talk about. Who would they be if they couldn't describe the insults, violence, and oppression that their lives and the television news were made up of? If they didn't have Kennedy or Elijah to quarrel about? They excused themselves for everything. Every job of work undone, every bill unpaid, every illness, every death was the man's fault. And Guitar was becoming just like them. Except he made no excuses for himself, just agreed, it seemed to Milkman, with every grievance he heard. So you can see here the abyss between them, right? One understands the situation, the problems that they are facing. The other one is completely separated from that, at least at this point in the story, because it's very important to emphasize that. So at one point, Milkman realizes that Guitar has a secret, okay, and this secret is going to cause further division between them. He realizes that Guitar belongs to a group called the 7 Days, and that is all that I'm going to say, because I do want you to have a good experience of this text. But that is an important detail and something that, you know, makes them become a little bit more separated than they were before. So speaking of structure, what we have here in Song of Solomon is exactly 337 pages. The story is divided into 15 chapters, and those chapters are in turn divided into 2 parts. The second part is a little bit shorter than the first one. In the first part, what we explore, what we have is Milkman, his family, right? And we are also introduced to the conflict within the family, within Milkman's family, and also the conflict with Guitar. So that is part number 1, a kind of introductory and already introducing the conflict type of section. And then in part 2, which is a little bit slower, I found it, it is concerned with Milkman's journey. It's kind of like a quest type of part. He's trying to find out about his family so that he can find out about himself. So there's an element of the journey right here in the second part. And it's a journey both in time and in space, because you can see it almost as a journey to the past. He's going to find out about his ancestors and finding out, you know, where you come from so that you can start to determine where it is that you're going to go. That kind of idea that we have with this 2-part structure in the novel. I wanted to tell you also a little bit about subgenres. Okay, I think this is always important. And in the case of Song of Solomon, I see at least 2 subgenres at play here. The first one I want to mention is the coming-of-age story, and in this case you could also say the Bildungsroman. Coming-of-age, Bildungsroman, sometimes there are different things, but in this case both of the labels apply. And we hear about Milkman's story from exactly, you know, precisely the moment that he is born, until he becomes a young adult. So this is really a novel that traces the development of the character. And one thing I like about it is that the narrative just unravels beautifully. Okay, we accompany Milkman in this journey, in this quest to the past, and as he learns more and more about himself and his family, we also learn more about that. So it's like, you know, we are walking together with him in a sense. And the other subgenre that I wanted to mention, you know, we have the coming of age Bildungsroman, and we also have, of course, a family saga. Okay, because the story focuses on Milkman, but we also hear about the fates of the other characters in the family, including the previous generations. So that is very important. That element of the family saga is just, you know, a salient feature of this text. Now, regarding style, you know, I think the storytelling in Song of Solomon is just masterful. That is one of the strengths of Toni Morrison. She's just a masterful storyteller in all of the works that I have read by her so far, at least. And I wanted to mention also two elements in this regard right here. The first one, I called it amplification. And here's what I mean by that. You're going to notice that as you read, you may hear about an event just mentioned, right, in passing. And then later on, as you continue to read, that event is going to be explored more in detail. So that is what I mean by amplification. First you mention it, then you go in more detail. And what we are doing here is we are putting together the pieces of a puzzle. It's kind of like a Faulknerian type of approach, right? And very closely related to that, the second element that I wanted to go into is, of course, the notion of perspective. I am sure you were expecting that with Toni Morrison, as we would with William Faulkner. This is another thing that she shares with him. Not surprisingly at all, Toni Morrison wrote her thesis on William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. So, you know, these are authors that, at the very least, she admired. So perspective, right? We often hear a story and then, you know, we hear it from a different perspective. The best example that I can give you for that is, for example, at one point, Milkman hears a story from the perspective of his father and then from the perspective of his mother. So which one is the true one? You know, we have to decide. The truth, most of the time, in many cases at least, lies right in the middle. It's kind of like a combination of the two. But as we say in Spanish, you have to hear the other bell too, right? You want to know how the other bell rings too, so that you can have a more objective approach to things. Both of these, right, amplification, the idea of perspective, they make this novel just compulsively readable. Once again, because we are trying to put together this puzzle, right? Just as Milkman is, we accompany him once again in the quest. Folklore, legend, myth, truth, okay, all of these things are important in the work of Toni Morrison, and in particular when it comes to Song of Solomon. That is one of the reasons why this novel is considered her first great novel, even though the previous two are really good also. So Song of Solomon incorporates quite a bit of folklore, and part of Milkman's challenge, you're going to notice as he tries to figure things out, is to differentiate precisely what is legend, what is myth, what is fact. And the problem here is that as he realizes, he comes into contact with many people for whom all of these things are just very closely interwoven, to the extent that it's very difficult to tell them apart. You don't know where the legend begins and where the fact stops, where the myth begins. All of this is something that in many cases is going to remain unclear. And I think, unfortunately, most of us at least tend to think of folktales, legends, myths are as stories that are not true. Right? When you think of a legend, yeah, it's something that somebody made up, right? It's not true. In this case, and in many others, I think we have to make a difference between truth and fact. Okay? If you ask me, just to give you a quick example, is Beauty and the Beast a true story? I would say that yes it is. You know, a tale as old as time, true as it can be, as the song goes. It's not a fact, right? It didn't really happen. There was not a historical Beauty and the Beast, but it is a story that conveys a lot of truths about the human condition. So in that sense, I would say it is true. And that is what I'm talking about right here. I think sometimes the fact that something is not factual doesn't make it untrue. It doesn't make it any less true. And I think this is what's at play here in Song of Solomon. Many of the stories are not factual, but that doesn't mean that they are not true. And that brings us to the very important topic of, drumroll please, Magical realism. Okay, that is a term, a label that you may have heard applied to certain works by Toni Morrison. In particular, when people do that, they are talking about Song of Solomon and also Beloved, of course, which can be read as many things, but one of those is as a ghost story. So listen to this. In Song of Solomon, one of the characters is said to have been killed by ghosts. Okay, then we have the figure of Pilate, who is feared by many people as if she were a witch. And get this, she has no navel. Okay, she has no belly button. There's this idea that she kind of gave birth to herself. She brought herself into the world. So the idea of not having a navel has to do with independence, right? Not depending on anybody, being something separate, right? So that's another element right there. And then towards the end of the novel and towards the beginning, because in a different way, right, with that very first sentence, we have the figure or the image of the flying man, right? But here's the thing, when towards the end of the novel we hear about that idea of this man who just flew away, the person who is telling the story introduces an element of ambiguity, because she says something like, oh yeah, those are all lies that were told. They're stories that were made up by people, but this is what they said, that this person just had the ability to fly away. So the question, right, is it magical realism? Okay, and I think this is a question that you could answer as both yes and no, depending on how you look at it, of course. So if by magical realism you mean Gabriel Garcia Marquez, then I would say no, not really. This is not that kind of magical realism, but it is Toni Morrison's own brand of magical realism. And that is a type of magical realism that is closer to the African-American experience, to African-American culture. And it is a little bit more ambiguous than the kind of magical realism that you find, for example, in 100 Years of Solitude. As you may know, in Latin American literature, we have magical realism, which is the kind of thing that Gabriel Garcia Marquez and other authors do. But there's also a less known kind of brand of that, and that is the marvelous real, lo real maravilloso, which was a term penned by Alejo Carpentier, the great writer from Cuba. I have talked about The Lost Steps, if you are interested in hearing about his work. I think if we take the kind of magical realism that you find in the work of Toni Morrison, it is much closer to Lo Real Maravilloso, the marvelous real of Alejo Carpentier, than to the magical realism that we associate with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So those are my 2 cents on that issue. Bottom line, Song of Solomon is just not only one of the best novels written by Toni Morrison, but I believe it is one of the best novels ever published in the US. By exploring in depth the lives of African Americans, Morrison was able to convey truths about the human condition, truths that apply to everybody. And while doing this, she also told unforgettable stories, and that is one of the many reasons why she is such a popular author. These are great stories, and they are very well told. If you're new to her work, I'm going to recommend that you begin with Sula. Okay, Sula is just a brief masterpiece. It's one of those books that develop the idea of friendship, right? They go into what constitutes a friendship. In this case, friendship between 2 women. So it's a compelling story. It's a quick read, and it's just very, very deep. So I would recommend that you begin with Sula. But I would say that based on my experience of her work, I've read her first 4 novels. Any of those is really a good place to start. I started with The Bluest Eye, and I was hooked. Okay, I just wanted to keep reading her. My next experience of her work is probably going to be Jazz, because I have a copy of that novel and I haven't read it. So I'm going to continue with that one, and then I'll just see what I can find, and I'll continue to read her, because I think she is just one of the best storytellers that I have ever encountered in my journey as a reader. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. As always, I am happy to hear your thoughts and your questions. Those were my 2 cents on Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.